assessing, but if you are assessing, what is your biggest challenge there? Yeah, ideally related to speaking, but that's fine. Assessing writing is a nightmare. That's a whole separate issue. Ah, that's a good one. Ah. Ooh. That's a good one. I feel a theme coming out of this one as well. See if a few of you are still going. So I'll give you another few seconds. Another heart. I like the hearts. Remember the persons that's sending me hearts, I like. Hearts are always good. Any more? Oh yeah, so let's see, one or two still going. Are we all done? Okay, so again, I think we can safely say we've got a very clear result in terms of the challenge, and that is criteria, dealing with the criteria. Okay, thank you very much for answering those questions. That gives me a bit of a better idea of who I'm talking to and what we're going to do today. So, basically, what I plan to do then in that case is we'll have a think first of all about how we can actually motivate students to speak, what sort of things can we do, and then we'll have a look at the issue of criteria if we have time. So what I'd like you to do is get into groups of how many? Let's say groups of 4 or 5, and I'd like you to discuss with your partner or partners, ideally if you can speak to somebody that you don't know or that isn't in your institution, because then you get input from other institutions and you get new ideas. Just find out what your colleagues do to motivate students to speak, and then I'll give you a few ideas of what I do to try and get students to speak, apart from standing over them going, speak, speak. So if you're not speaking, I will be standing over you going, speak. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to discuss with your colleagues what is your best way to get your students speaking and to improve their vocabulary. Action.
Опоры, мне кажется. Вообще speaking. Мне кажется, speaking. Carolyn, are we discussing speaking in general or at the exam?
Preparing students for the speaking exam. Yeah. So if you're preparing them for the exam, how do you get them first of all to speak, and how do you improve their vocabulary? What do you do to target that vocabulary? Or what can you do? Even if you don't do it, what could you do?
Сначала принудительно, потом они, наверное, с пассивы в активную. Ну, как бы давать им опору, например, там, сколько лексических языков, которые они должны включить, да, подготовленные. Ну, логично, да, логические речи. А потом все равно это должно быть какие-то клише, или фразы, или даже лексические обсуждать. Нет, ну структура-то тут не мешает.
Ну, не вкусный экзамен сейчас ЕГЭ, там же есть вот эта книжка, там все клише есть. Вот по этим клише мы начинаем работать, как правило. Все-таки. Да, там на первых страничках, как начинать, как сравнение делать, какие фразы говорить. Вот это сначала. Ну, заполнение лексикона уже идет все.
On the board, we've done that. So what we're talking about now is basically, this is the challenge when we're preparing students for exam. So I asked everybody that came in what the challenges were, and these were the main things that came out. So basically, vocabulary and getting students to actually speak, and then the amount of time that you have to prepare them. So what we're doing now is just discussing in groups how you can prepare your students for the exam. So what do you do to improve their vocabulary and to get them to actually speak? What is like your best idea? So if you want to join these ladies here and just find out what they're saying, and obviously put your input in as well. So for the speaking test that you prepare your students for, whether that's EGE or Cambridge Main Suite or IELTS or whatever, how do you get your students to speak and how do you improve their vocabulary? Okay, well maybe discuss that with these guys and see, you know, what.
Здесь даже на русском.
Сначала вот начать с этого, а потом
А в этом и трудность наша. Вот эссе, когда пишут, имеет сочинить, та же самая трудность, они не знают, что да. Five sentences instead of 10. Что еще? Он показывает учиться еще 5. Они сейчас вот здесь, вот все равно очень мало кто остался, который вот действительно средний abilities. Ну и надо сказать, конкретные экзамены, что я не знаю, какие условия. Да, спасибо.
Я же хочу показать, читай задание.
Okay, ladies, have we got any gents? Yes, ladies and odd gent. Let me stop you there. And I'm going to ask each sort of team, if you like, each group going around, to give me one of your strategies for getting your students to speak and for improving the vocabulary. So I'm just going to work from the front up there and down there and down there. So maybe make sure you have somebody to speak in your team. So this team here.
Okay, describing pictures, comparing pictures, photos.
Describing comparing pictures, asking questions, pictures or photos.
So we introduce topical vocabulary.
Okay, so ask questions, intro. If you can't read my writing, I apologise now. Topical vocabulary. Okay, good. Thank you very much, that team. Next team.
To use different cards from the workbooks, for example, Spotlight, to use cards,
Different
cards,
cards.
spelling
Right, sorry.
cards.
Yep.
In Spotlight, there are different.
Yep. Okay.
It's the best.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Next team. Make speaking meaningful. Good. I've got one of those horrible pieces of chalk that's got something in it. Make speaking. Now, when you say make speaking meaningful, what do you mean? How do you do it? What do you mean and how do you do it?
Target vocabulary.
Right, use interesting topics. Yeah.
To make it interesting and real life.
Okay, so authentic, real life, interesting. Okay, interesting. It's so long since I've used chalk. I can't write with chalk anymore. I'm so sorry.
Take another one, try it.
It wouldn't make any difference. It's just that I can't write with chalk. Okay, the next team. Next team going back. Okay.
Yes.
Give tips to start. Give tips to start speaking. Give tips. Good. Any more from the team at the back? Yeah.
Make students videos about different cultural traditions and discuss them.
Okay.
Tourists want to learn something about the countries they've never been to, and thus they have a great desire to ask questions, and therefore they learn different vocabulary.
That's right. And they've got the input and they've got the interest. So watch videos and discuss. Good. I like it. Yep. And then there was another hand up. Yeah. Oh.
Like giving them some vocabulary to learn and asking them to make sense, to make a story or a poem using this vocabulary.
So just odd words and then they have to build a story out of it.
Not odd, but vocabulary to some topic.
Yeah.
Topical vocabulary.
But just individual words,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, make a story. Okay, good. And then there's another hand up at the back. Pair work, yeah.
Yes, and debate classes, debates.
Debates, yeah, debates and pair work, good. Sorry? Yeah, so pair work or group work. Good, thank you. Well, okay, so did we, good. Okay, let's move over. Team at the back, have you got anything? No. Team at the back on the other side. Sorry, say again? Make short videos. That's a fabulous idea. Yep, good. Working down. Next rules. Next group. Anybody? Yep. Okay, so interesting topics. Let's say real communication, right? Real as opposed to pretend communication when you're talking to your friends. Yeah. Good. Moving further down, Dave, I think you had your hand up. Yeah.
So it is important to reward students
Oh,
by this stimulating them.
sorry, say again?
Yeah, by this stimulating them, right? For maybe better future success. And not to interrupt them. So while they speak, maybe also achieve success.
Yep.
And to give them a choice.
Yep. Good, excellent.
And as for vocabulary, maybe along with vocabulary we should introduce some speech patterns and some scaffolding.
Yes. Yeah, good. Maybe I'll follow you.
Not a new idea, but we have a cross-cultural particularity of the Russians that we use foreign language to show off. That's why to make a mistake, that's a big problem for us. We're afraid of it. Maybe just to promise not to assess first. First, just to make them speak fluently, and only after that by providing them with the interesting topics, with free practice of speaking. Only after that, we introduce all these techniques that should
Let them make mistakes.
That's a really important one, actually. Not just for Russians, but for many, many nationalities. So, don't immediately assess them. I say immediately because actually as teachers, whenever our students do anything, we're assessing them. Might be informally, but we're assessing them because we're always saying, what do they know, what do they not know? I've effectively been assessing you guys this morning already because I've been asking you, what are your challenges? Now that's not saying, did you get it right or wrong? There's no right or wrong answer. But I need to find out from you guys where you feel the weaknesses are so that I can help you. Now how many of you, because this is a really good point, how many of you, when you get your students working in groups, they'll be talking away, as soon as you go near them, silence. Yeah? Because they assume you're assessing them. And so this is actually a really, really important point. And one of the things that I do, I'll tell you about afterwards, that relates to this, because this is really important. If students think that they're being assessed, not just Russians, but I work with students from all over the world, they will shut up as soon as you're near them because they're afraid of making a mistake. On the whole. There are some that will talk rubbish forever, and it doesn't matter how many times you correct them, they'll still talk rubbish. But for the vast majority, they shut up as soon as you're near. So that's a good one. Any more down the front here? Any other ideas?
We also introduce formative assessment just to encourage students to talk and to fit their criteria without any grading.
Formative assessment. Good. That's my abbreviation for assessment. It's not a swear word or anything, it's just my abbreviation for assessment, because I write the word 100,000 times a day. Any other comments from the front?
Well, actually, we've been talking about personalized approach.
Yes.
Because as soon as it concerns themselves, so they will start talking.
Yeah.
And also probably it's a good idea to ask some provocative questions and to discuss controversial issues. Because actually they will forget that they're just using the language for the sake of using the language.
Yeah.
They will be discussing the content.
Exactly, that's it. Now you've got to be careful obviously with provocative questions, so I'm going to put be careful, because you can get yourself into trouble. And I don't want anybody saying, I got fired because Carolyn told me to ask some provocative questions. I don't want anybody coming back to me next year saying I've lost my job because I asked provocative questions. You want to get them to talk, and actually that's absolutely true, because if there's something that they feel strongly about, they will forget the fact that they're making mistakes, and suddenly you've got World War III going on in the classroom as they argue different sides, and you're like, whoa, 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 calm down, it's okay, it's just an opinion, it's fine. So do be careful with provocative questions, but they can actually be really useful. Now I'd like to come back to this. How many of you have heard of or used task-based learning? Anybody heard of task-based learning? Anybody use task-based learning? One or two? Yeah. Okay, so one of the things that I do is whenever I'm teaching speaking, I take a task-based approach. And what that means is, this comes from Willis 1986, Willis and Willis actually. What that means is I will give them some sort of model of what we're going to do. So let's take a very simple situation like where we want to find out about, let's stick with transport because I was speaking about transport yesterday. We want to find out about how people come to school. So I might give them a video or a recording of somebody asking questions from a questionnaire. So, excuse me, could I just interrupt you for a second? I'd like to ask you some questions, if I may. And the person will say, oh yes, that's fine. And then you say, so I'm just working on a questionnaire to find out about how much people spend on their lunches at the university. And then they get an example of the kinds of things that they might be asked. I'm not specifically saying you must do this, you must use this language, but they see an example and then they get an example of the questionnaire so that they see the kinds of questions that might come up. But it's not the exact same thing that I'm going to ask them to do. It's a different thing, but it's a similar. So if you think back to the critical thinking skills we were talking about yesterday, it's applying. It's taking the knowledge from the one questionnaire and applying it for a different questionnaire. And then I'll say, okay, go away and design your questionnaire. Go out into the streets of Southampton, ask your questions, come back to me. So it's a 2-hour class. I should say it's a 2-hour class. Come back to me in 1 hour with your answers. And when you come back, I want you to take your answers and present your responses. And then they come back and they work through in their teams, putting together a little presentation of their responses. At this point, I am just wandering around. I'm not talking to them, I'm not helping them, I'm not giving them any language that they have to use. They are completely on their own. So whatever language they have to deal with. However, I'm not just walking around and going, have a cup of tea, have a biscuit. I'm walking around and I'm listening very carefully to the mistakes that they're making. And we can give reactive feedback and proactive feedback. So there will be language that I want them to use, and I will have a list of the language that I want them to use, but there will also be language that will come out, the kinds of mistakes that will come out because they're working in a task-based situation, they're dealing with the task, they're concentrating on the content. After they think they're finished, I stop them and I say, right, these are some of the mistakes that I've heard. And we go through the mistakes. I also pick out some of the really good stuff. And I say, this is a really good phrase that I heard. I think you can use this, the other groups can use this, this is another good phrase, and here's some additional language that I'd like you to use. So then I give them the proactive feedback, which is my language that I want them to use, and the reactive feedback, which is what I've heard going around. Now obviously the difficulty with that is that you have to be quite on the ball and know what sort of thing you want to correct. But then once they've got that feedback, they redo the task. So they polish the task, if you like. So in the same way as we talk about drafting and redrafting in assessing writing, or in writing, we effectively draft the task, they get some feedback, and they redraft it and perform, if you like. And then after that, they will get some further help on the kinds of mistakes that are still occurring. So if I spot that somebody is still having a problem with forming questions, then that will be something I can deal with the next time. But in principle, that first run through of the task is about them using the language that they have, getting comfortable with using the vocabulary, using the grammar structures. Even if they're making mistakes, they get comfortable with it, and then we polish it a little bit. So that's one aspect. So feel free to look for task-based learning, because that's a genuinely nice approach where they know you're not assessing them immediately. And especially if you just sort of, what I tend to do, obviously I don't have a classroom like this, we have a flat classroom, and I just sit myself down in the middle on a chair, so I'm at the same height as them, and I sit and I listen. So they don't actually know who I'm listening to. I might be listening over here and I might be listening over there, it depends. And I might be looking over there but actually listening over there. So they don't know who I'm listening to. Often they do go, oh, that was my mistake when I write it up on the board, but I don't tell them this is your mistake. Because if I say, oh, this was your mistake, you go, now the whole class knows I've made a mistake. If they say, oh, that was my mistake, then that's their choice. But I might then just go around afterwards when they're repolishing and say, by the way, that mistake up there, that's what I heard from you, so just make sure. So that they know that that was their mistake and it hasn't just gone over their head. So that's one option. The other thing that I do in terms of vocabulary is I give them specific cards. So I teach presentations a lot, for example, and I teach discussions, negotiations, and this kind of thing. And I use little cards with particular phrases on. And one of my favourite tasks that I've been using for a gazillion billion years now, and that works every time, I'll share with you, is when we're talking about discussions, we have certain phrases with like agreement, disagreement, and so on and so forth. And students work in groups of about 4 or 5 usually, and each group gets an envelope of all the different phrases for agreeing, disagreeing, expressing opinions, clarifying misunderstandings, and so on and so forth. And the idea of the game is to play cards and to get rid of as many of those phrases as possible. So they have to discuss a topic which I give them, it can be any topic, but every time they open their mouth, they have to get rid of a card. So let's say you say, as part of your thing, you say, I think we should all have breaks of at least 2 hours in between a 20-minute class. And I have my card and I say, that's a very interesting idea, however, I believe, blah, blah, blah. And my phrase is, that's an interesting idea, however. And then I can throw my card away if I continue the sentence. However, if the rest of my team think that I haven't justified throwing away the card, they can throw it right back at me. So you learn who your friends are. And the idea is to throw away as many cards as possible. And then suddenly they forget that they're actually potentially making mistakes. And again, I sit myself in the middle of the room, listen to the mistakes that they're making, and we go over it afterwards. But for those 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, however long they're discussing in their own little world with the concentration on getting rid of as many cards as possible. So that's another of the things that I do. when I do presentations, I give them a list of phrases, and they have a big long list, and they choose the phrases that they think they can learn. So phrases that are new to them, but not too complex that they're way too difficult that they'll never learn them, but they select, going back to choices, they select the phrases that they want. They write their phrases on little cards, ready for their presentation, and then we do what we call a ball bearing exercise. Anybody any idea what a ball bearing exercise is? No reason why you should. Not a snowball. So we have like 4 seats here, and then we have someone here. So we have person 1, 2, 3, 4, and person A, B, C, D. Now the people in the middle will stay where they are. So if you've got kinesthetic learners and non-kinesthetic learners, you ask the students, if you like moving around, sit in the outside chairs, sit on the outside chairs. If you don't like moving around, if you're not a kinesthetic learner, sit in the middle and make yourself comfortable, because you will be there for a while. And what happens is the inner circle, or square in this case, do their presentation. So they've got all their phrases, then I give them a basic presentation. It could be like talk about your job, or talk about your hobby, or talk about what you did at the weekend, whatever it is. And they do a mini presentation to their partner about their hobby, their job, whatever. Their partner then does a mini presentation back at them. After that, these people all move round to the next partner, and they do the same thing again, and they do the same thing again, and they do the same thing again, and then if we have time, they come back to their original partner. Sometimes, depending on the time, I might miss out one of the rounds, so they go 1, 2, 3, and back to 1. But it's important that they come back to their original partner, because after the first round, I give them feedback on the mistakes, so that they're not always making the same mistakes. So again, I'm sitting in the middle of them as they're working, as they're talking, and I'm picking up the mistakes. We give feedback at the end of the round, move them around, they do the same thing again, but the second time, the listener has to listen for the mistakes and give them a virtual slap around the head and tell them to correct themselves if they make that mistake. The third time, the same thing again. The listener not only listens, but has to give them a slap around the head if they hear any mistakes. It's a virtual slap around the head. It's just going, oh, no, it's not actually hitting them. It's just, oh no, you just said what she said there. Just check your, and they correct themselves. The last round, they go back to their original partner and they do the presentation again. When they do the presentation again, the listener now is not just listening, have they got rid of the mistakes, but they're listening to what was the difference from the first version. And what invariably comes out is that they might have changed something, but they're far more fluent, they're far more confident, and they speak a lot more, they talk about a lot more things than they did in the first time round. So that they're just doing the same thing over and over again. And then similarly, when it comes to their assessment, they have to do a presentation, but it's a bigger presentation, and I say, make sure you do the same thing. Talk to yourself in the mirror. Sit your husband or wife or girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever down and have them listen to you. Do it in the room on your own, do it wherever, but do it over and over and over again, so that they get used to these fixed phrases in their head. It doesn't become learnt because they do change it, but they have a general idea of what they want to say and how they want to say it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Any questions on any of those 3 options that I've given you for getting them to talk?
Carolyn, and what about those people sitting in a square? They are only to talk to each other?
So number 1 does a presentation for person A, and then A presents to number 1. And then A moves to number 2. Number 2 presents to person A, and person A presents to number 2. And then they move round again. So they're always doing the presentation each. So this person does 3 or 4 presentations, and this person does 3 or 4 presentations, or 5 if you've got time. So in each case, every time they move to a new partner, both of them do the presentation. But there are some people who stay still, and there are some people that move around, because otherwise everybody would be moving and it would be chaos. So I would do the presentation here, you present to me. The next round I go over here, I present to you, you present to me. The next round I go over here, I present to you, you present to me. And then I go back to my original partner and do it again. And my original partner has to think about how my presentation has changed since the first round.
What sort of presentations do they make?
The guys that I do this with a lot are executive MBA business people. But you can do it with students. You can ask them to talk about their hobby, what they did at the weekend, what they want to do when they grow up. You can obviously do it when presenting a picture. They can describe their picture to their partner. It doesn't have to be a presentation. It can be anything that you want your students to talk about. It can be a miniature debate. So if they've got a topic that they have to agree with or disagree with, let's say I'm agreeing with the topic, you're disagreeing, we have a little debate, I move on, I agree, you disagree, we have a debate, I move on, I agree, you disagree, we have a debate, and I come back to here. I can describe a picture, I can talk about the weather, I can do it with anything, but it's about getting them to notice the value of practice. So it's about practicing fluency and how when you've gone over something in your head so many times, you don't need to write it down word for word. They're not allowed to write anything about the content. They can use the presentation phrases, but the content has to be completely from their head. They cannot write anything about the content. And it's about making them aware of the fact that if you go over something in your head, or if you go over something out loud, enough times it will become automatic. How many of you as language learners have stood outside a shop going, right, I've got to ask for this in English, how do I say it? Right, if I say this, and then they might say this, so I need to say this. And you go through it in your head, right? Yeah. And you walk in the shop and you go, blah, 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 and you come out with what you wanted. Because you've gone through it in your head. Maybe once or twice you've thought about different things. It's exactly the same, but this time we're getting them to do it orally so that they see the value of it.
And I have a question.
Yeah.
While they are doing this presentation, you as a teacher hear strong mistakes.
Yeah.
You never correct them while they're talking.
I don't correct them while they're talking because that interrupts the flow.
Yeah, I know, but the question is, for example, me as a teacher, I'm a little bit worried about the fact that they can remember the wrong or use the phrases the wrong way, and they will have it in their mind
That's
forever.
why we stop them after the first round.
Okay.
And
After
I
the
stop
first
them.
round,
I stop them after the first
then
round.
we discuss mistakes.
We discuss the mistakes. I
And
stop them
then
again
do it
after the
again.
second round. If
Okay,
I've heard some more mistakes, I stop them again. So then, if you're listening to me, it's your job to have a look at all the mistakes on the board and listen to me and see if I make any of those mistakes. And if I do, it's your job to correct me.
Okay.
Or to just say, not to say, you did that wrong, but to say, look, there's a mistake. And I go, oh, right, yeah, of course, yeah. And I correct myself. And then hopefully, after 2 or 3 times, I stop making that mistake. But that's why it's really, really important in the first round to be really on the ball and listening for as many mistakes as you can get, and then give the feedback. Because if they make the same mistake over and over again, then that's the thing that becomes inground, and that's what we don't want. So it's really important to be listening constantly for something that's a mistake. Now obviously, that works best with smaller groups, but I tend to do it with groups of around about 20 to 25. Yeah?
Well, we have the same game, but in another way. We stand students in 2 lines.
Yeah.
And they are talking in pairs.
Yeah, exactly.
Then I clap my hand, and they change the partner stepping in the right.
Exactly, yeah.
That is
You
better.
can send them off into different
It's better.
corners. Exactly, it's the same thing.
They
but
say
it's
the
about,
same.
Exactly,
with
it's
another
about
person.
doing the same thing over and over again.
And dyadic circles, isn't it the same name for it?
Sorry, say again?
Dyadic circles.
Could be.
Could be. Okay, I just heard this dyadic circles when they actually move like two circles.
Yeah, it's a similar sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So where you position them is entirely up to you. I just tend to do it as, I call it speed dating. It's like speed dating. Speed dating for business people in my case, but speed dating for whoever. So they just move around and they practice and practice. Okay, we are pretty much out of time, so I want to just mention very briefly the next question, which was the thing about criteria. Just very, very quickly, what is the issue with criteria? So anyone that wrote criteria, what was the issue?
They are blurred.
They're blurred.
Blurred, right?
Okay, so what you can do with the criteria is, the best thing to do is get examples of speaking performances at different levels. And if I could keep you all morning, we could do all sorts of things, but I'm only allowed to keep you until 10:55, which is about what it is now. But the best thing to do is keep examples of different performances. Have you heard of Ceph-Train? Anybody heard of Ceph-Train? No? Ceph-Train is a great piece of equipment, a great little tool. What it is, this was a project that was done in Finland where they use the CEFR. You're familiar with the CEFR? Anybody not familiar with the CEFR? So the B1, B2, blah, blah. So what they did here is, if you just Google Ceph-Train project and Ceph-Train Finland, something like that, you will come to the page and they've got listening activities, speaking activities, reading and writing activities, and you can train yourself to be at the level of the CEFR. I was trying to get it up on this computer, but it needs a little add-on, so you can't always get it. But if you include the add-on in your computer, it's just like some sort of flash player or something that you need. Then what you can do is you can look at each different skill. So for the speaking task, you listen to someone doing a speaking test, and you decide, using the CEFR descriptors, what level you think it is. You then click to say, I think this is a B1, and it will tell you then whether you're right or wrong. It will tell you what the actual CEFR level is for that, and it will also tell you why that person was rated at that level. So it gets you into what is expected. So with the criteria, if you can then do a similar sort of thing with the criteria either for the EGE or for Cambridge or IELTS or whatever it is you're working with, ask yourself what part of that criteria, that box of criteria or those descriptors, matches that performance and why. And if you can do it as a group, you can agree, for this performance, this is the performance I would expect. For this descriptor, I expect this performance. This descriptor links to this performance. And then you can, if you can build a body of tasks, either from EGE sample papers or from IELTS sample papers or whatever, where you look at what the professional raters have said using the descriptors, then you can use it as a kind of standardization in your institution where you say, look, this is this level because of this and this and this. Okay, let's have a look at this. What do we think? I think it's an A1. I think it's an A2. Why do you think it's an A1? What descriptor have you got in the criteria that tells you it's this? It's a fairly simple way of doing it, but it's actually what the professionals do. So when we link exams, I've been involved in various validation projects where we link exams to the CEFR, and that is exactly what we do. We sit down with all the descriptors, we have all the different tasks, whether it's writing, reading, whatever, and we have to justify our decision referring to the criteria. And I noticed some of you put subjectivity. It's difficult to avoid comparing, or it's difficult to not be subjective. you have to be objective. So your own personal opinion has to leave the room. Sorry, I respect your opinions, but your opinion has to leave the room at this point, because what you have to work with is the criteria. Now, if you want to invite me back, we can do a whole session on criteria and linking to criteria, but unfortunately I was only given 55 minutes, so we will have to leave it there. But hopefully that gives you an idea of how you can use the criteria to justify the level, but you do need a body of professionally rated samples with the results, if you like, with the criteria and with the levels that they have been assigned to and why. But you can use those then as training material in your own institutions. But Self-Train is a good start.
Is there a similar tool for writing?
Yes, it's got listening, reading, speaking and writing. It's got all 4 skills.
So I can read, writing and check.
Yeah, so what they've got like some writing tasks in there. You read what the students have written and you decide what level they are. We're just finished. Okay, I will have to stop there, much as I would love to stay and talk to you for longer.